No one out here is here by accident. Nobody's family chose this rock. That's the first thing you have to understand about the town 300 miles out in the Bering Sea. Two governments, in turn, decided that people would live on this island and then would not let them leave. The town exists today because of that decision. And the strange part, the part that pulls you in, is that the people they hauled out here are still here. Look at it from the air, and it doesn't make sense. A treeless smudge of volcanic rock, ringed by gray water, fogged over a third of the summer. No road connects it to anything, because there's nothing to connect it to. One small airstrip, a single dock, and a community that, by every logic of how towns get built, should not exist. But it does. So the question is simple, and it's the question you're already asking. Why would anyone live out here at all? The answer is that for most of this island's history, they had no say in it. This is St. Paul Island, in the group called the Pribilofs. It sits far out in the middle of the Bering Sea, roughly 300 miles west of the Alaska mainland, closer to Russia's edge of the world than to anywhere you've heard of. There are no trees. The land is low and volcanic and green in the short summer, then locked in wind and fog for much of the year. The temperature moves in a narrow band, rarely much below freezing, rarely much above the low 50s. It is one of the foggiest inhabited places in the country, and on this island live a few hundred people, most of them Unangan, the native Alaskans long known as Aleuts. Here's what you need to sit with. Before the 1780s, no one lived on these islands at all. They were empty, rich with seals, yes, thick with birds, but empty of people. For all the thousands of years that humans had lived in the surrounding region, in the Aleutians, and along the Alaskan coast, no one had made a permanent home out here on the Pribilofs. Maybe it was too far. Maybe it was too exposed. Whatever the reason, these islands sat uninhabited while the rest of the coast filled in. So the town isn't old the way a fishing village is old, where someone found a good harbor generations ago and their children stayed and it grew. It's the opposite. Someone found a good harbor full of animals worth money and brought other people out to work them. That is a completely different kind of founding, and it changes everything about how you read the place. When you look at that little cluster of buildings in the fog and ask, why is there a town here? The honest answer is not because people wanted to live here. It's because someone else wanted the seals and needed hands. So how does a community survive being created essentially as a labor pool on an island with almost nothing, no timber, no farmland worth the name, no road out, and no neighbors, and still be standing and governing itself generations later? That's the real story of St. Paul, not the fog and not the seals. The endurance of the people, the fog and the seals were used to hold. Keep that in mind as we go, because everything that follows is really a story about people refusing to disappear. Let's go back to how it started, because you can't understand the town without it. In the 1780s, Russian fur traders came into these waters chasing one animal, the northern fur seal. Every summer, more than 1 million of them haul out onto the beaches of these islands to breed. It is one of the largest gatherings of marine mammals anywhere on Earth. Picture it, mile after mile of black rock and dark sand, so densely packed with animals that you can hear them from far off, a low roar that never stops, and a smell that carries out over the water before you ever reach the shore. To the Russians, that was not a wonder of nature. It was a fortune lying on the sand. But a fortune in seal fur is useless if you can't get it off the animal and onto a ship. You need people to do the killing and the skinning, people who knew this cold, this sea, this work, and could do it season after season without dying of it. The Russians had already found such people on the Aleutian island chain to the south, the Unangan, who had lived in that brutal maritime world for thousands of years. So the traders brought them north, sometimes by force, and settled them on the Pribilofs to harvest seals. The islands got their first human residents not as settlers, not as families who chose a homeland, but as a workforce imported to serve an animal. Everything about the town flows from that one fact. Then, in 1867, the United States bought Alaska from Russia, and the United States bought this arrangement along with it. What followed is documented in the federal record, and it is not gentle. For decades, the government ran the fur seal enterprise on these islands and ran the Unangan people as part of it. They were treated as wards of the state. Their labor was directed. Their movement was controlled. They could not simply decide to board a ship and go build a life somewhere else. And their mail, at times, was read before they got it. One man who later became mayor of St. Paul described it plainly in the 1980s. He said they were dominated and that even their letters used to be censored. Sit with that detail for a second. Not the wages, not the housing, though those were bad too. The letters. A government agency reading a man's mail on an island in the middle of the Bering Sea because the people there were regarded as property of a program rather than as citizens who could speak freely. Historians and the community itself have compared the conditions to a kind of bondage. And this went on far longer than you would guess. This was not some brief cruelty in the 1800s that the country grew out of. This was a managed labor colony run by the federal government of the United States, and the essential shape of it held well into the 20th century within living memory of people who are still on the island today. That's the thing that's hard to hold in your head. The men who remembered the old system are not figures from a textbook. Some of them ran the town after it ended. I want to be careful here because this is real history about real people, and it isn't a spectacle. These are survivors. The coercion is the government's act. The endurance is theirs. That's the frame, and it's the honest one. And it's exactly that endurance that makes the rest of this story remarkable. Because somehow, out of a place built to trap them, these people made a town that is genuinely theirs. If you want to understand how people actually survive in the corners of America that almost nobody can reach, and how they turn even a place like this into home, that's what this channel exists to show you. So consider subscribing and coming along. Now back to the island, because the hardest chapter is still ahead. June of 1942, the Second World War had reached Alaska. Japanese forces had struck in the Aleutians and taken islands to the west, and the United States government, citing the danger, evacuated the Unangan people from their homes. On St. Paul, that meant roughly 300 people were given almost no warning and loaded onto a ship and taken more than 1,000 miles away to southeast Alaska. They were housed in an abandoned cannery. It was rotting. There was little clean water, little heat, poor food, and disease moved through the crowded rooms. One account described the conditions as worse than those set for German prisoners of war held elsewhere in the country. They were held there, unable to go home, for close to 2 years. Think about who these people were. They came from a treeless island of wind and open sky, a place where you can see the weather coming for an hour before it arrives. And they were confined in the dripping, dark, forested wet of southeast Alaska, in buildings that were falling apart, with sickness passing from room to room and no real way to stop it. Elders and small children were the most exposed. More than 1 in 10 of the people taken from these islands died in that internment, not in combat, in the camps they were sent to for their own protection. And when the survivors were finally allowed to return in 1944, some of their homes had been looted, in cases by the very servicemen who had been stationed on the islands while they were gone. That's the part that lands hardest. They came back to the one place in the world that was theirs, the place they had never been free to leave, and found that even in their absence, it had been picked over. And still, they stayed. They rebuilt, they buried their dead, and they started the town again. It took the country decades to reckon with any of this. In 1988, Congress passed a Restitution Act. and each eligible Aleut survivor of that wartime internment received a payment of $12,000 as redress. And separately, for the generations of coerced sealing labor that came before the war, a federal court awarded the Pribilov people a judgment of $8.5 million. Set those two things side by side, and you're looking at the United States government in its own official record, in a law and in a court ruling, admitting two separate wrongs done to one small community on one island. Money does not undo any of it. It doesn't bring back the people who died in that cannery. But it matters that the admission exists on paper with the country's name attached, because for a very long time, this history was simply not taught. Most Americans have never heard a word of it. The town endured the thing and then endured being forgotten, which is its own kind of weight. Now hold that thought, because here is where the story turns. This is a community that was relocated by one empire, held as wards by another, evacuated at gunpoint and interned, and it is still here. So the obvious question becomes, how? How is there still a functioning American town on a foggy volcanic rock 300 miles out to sea, with no road, no farmland, and no easy way in or out? What does it actually take to keep the lights on and the people fed? Let's walk through it, one system at a time. Start with food and supply, because on an island, that's everything. There is no road in. There will never be a road in. Everything that the town cannot pull from the sea or the land around it has to arrive one of two ways: by barge across open ocean, tied up at a single dock only a few hundred feet long, or by small plane onto a runway that the fog can close for days at a stretch. Air service runs to Dutch Harbor, out in the Aleutians, on a schedule that the weather rewrites constantly. You do not really book a flight off St. Paul. You book a hope, and you wait to see whether the sky agrees. When you live here, a grocery run is not a thing you do on a whim. There's no next town over. A box of cereal has crossed the Bering Sea to reach your kitchen, and it is priced like it. Fresh fruit is a small event, so people don't lean on the barge alone, because you cannot build a life on cargo that might be a week late and costs a fortune when it lands. They pull halibut and cod from the water, the same cold water their families have fished for 2 centuries. There are reindeer on the island, brought in generations ago, that people hunt. And there is still the seal, taken now for subsistence under a strict yearly cap of a little over 1,600 animals. That last one is a quiet echo of the whole story, if you stop and hear it. The animal that the empires killed for money on these beaches is now taken in careful numbers by the descendants of the people who were forced to do that killing. Except now the harvest belongs to the community. It feeds families instead of filling a company's ledger. The seal went from being the reason they were imprisoned to being one of the reasons they can stay. Now, power. And this one might surprise you. You'd expect a remote island like this to run on nothing but diesel. Drums of fuel barged across the sea and burned in a generator, the same way most far-flung Alaskan villages keep the lights on, and diesel is part of it. But back in 1999, the island's power company built a wind and diesel hybrid system and later added tall turbines, standing over 100 feet high and rated at 225 kilowatts each. This was one of the earlier village wind installations anywhere in rural Alaska. Think about what that means. One of the most isolated towns in the entire United States, on an island the vast majority of Americans will never see or even name, was actually ahead of the curve on wind power. And when you understand the situation, it stops being surprising and starts being obvious. When every single gallon of diesel has to cross an ocean to reach you, and the price reflects that whole journey, the wind that never stops blowing out here suddenly looks like the cheapest and most reliable thing you've got. It's already here. It's free. It never runs late. Stand near one of those turbines in a full Bering Sea gale, with the blades hammering the air overhead and the wind pushing you sideways, and you understand the logic in your bones. The wind is the one resource this island has in genuinely endless supply, so of course they learn to farm it. Then there's medicine, and here the isolation stops being an inconvenience and becomes something heavier. There is a community clinic on the island for everyday care, colds and stitches and checkups, and the ordinary run of things. That's enough. But out here, serious illness or a bad injury is a different equation entirely. A case that a mainland town would handle with a short ambulance ride to a nearby hospital becomes, on St. Paul, a medical evacuation by air. Someone has a heart attack or a fishing accident or a difficult birth, and the only real answer is a plane. And here's the cruel piece. The same fog that closes the runway to the mail plane closes it to the medevac. Weather does not care that it's an emergency. When the sky is shut, it is shut for everyone. So there are days when you can be a few hundred miles from a hospital and, for a stretch of hours or longer, have no practical way to reach one at all. You wait for the fog to lift, and you hope the person awaiting with you can wait that long. That is the arithmetic of living here that no wind turbine and no grocery barge can solve. Distance plus weather times time. It is the quiet risk that sits under every ordinary day on the island. The price of the isolation that is, in every other way, the whole point of the place. Which brings us to the last system, and in some ways the most important one, because it's the one the people took back for themselves. Governance. Who actually runs this place now? In that turn, a community reaching out and taking back the ground it was once held captive on is exactly the kind of story this channel goes looking for. So if you want more of them, take a second to subscribe before we get into it. Now, who runs St. Paul today? For most of its history, the answer was not the people who lived here. It was the fur company and then the federal government. The people of the island did the work, but the decisions were made elsewhere by men who would never spend a winter here. That commercial seal harvest, the whole reason the town was built in the first place, finally wound down and ended in the early 1980s. And when it ended, the old arrangement ended with it. For the first time since the 1780s, the future of St. Paul was actually up to the people of St. Paul. What they built in that opening is genuine self-rule, and it comes in layers. There's the city of St. Paul, the local government, the mayor and the council, the ordinary machinery of an American town. There's the Aleut community of St. Paul, the tribal government, carrying the authority and identity of the Unangan people themselves. And there's the village corporation, born out of the great settlement of native land claims in Alaska, which runs much of the island's power in its operations and its economy, and which exists to hold wealth for the community rather than extract it. There's even a community fisheries group that has used the island's share of the Bering Sea catch to send money back to residents, subsidizing the genuinely brutal cost of heating a home out here through a long, wet, freezing winter with extra help for the elders. Stack those together and you see something remarkable. After 2 centuries of being run by outsiders for profit, the people of St. Paul run St. Paul. They own the ground. They control the harvest. They answer to themselves. That is the quiet triumph buried underneath this whole dark story. And it took 200 years to arrive. So that's the town, fed by sea and barge and hunt, powered by wind and diesel, watched over by one clinic and a runway the fog can seal, governed at last by its own people, a community that took a place built to hold it captive and made it, against everything, a home. And if you followed the story this far, you already sense that something is about to go wrong, because the whole reason this town could feed itself and pay itself and hold itself together came down to one thing out in the water. Everything you have heard so far, the food, the money, the very ability of families to stay, rested on it. And this is where it all comes back around, Because here's the modern rhyme. The thing that trapped these people on this island for 200 years was the sea. The sea and what lived in it. First, it was the seal that pinned them here. And in recent times, it was another animal, one that made the town solvent and modern and self-governing. The snow crab. By the 21st century, St. Paul had become one of the great crab ports of the Bering Sea. The island's economy came to lean on that fishery almost entirely, by some measures around 90% of it. The taxes on the crab that came across its docks paid for the town. A processing plant on the island, described as the largest snow crab plant in the country, ran the season and employed the crews. The crab was the new seal. It was the reason the light stayed on. And then, in 2022, the crab was gone. Not fished out in the ordinary sense. Gone. Scientists went out to survey the Bering Sea, dropped their nets in the places the snow crab had always been, and could not find them. Billions of animals, by the best estimates, had simply vanished from the counts in the space of just a few years as the water warmed. Think about the scale of that. Not a bad season, not a dip. Billions of crab, the backbone of an entire town's economy, missing from the sea where they had always been. And for the first time in the roughly 40-year history of the fishery, the managers did the thing that had never once been done. They closed the Bering Sea snow crab season entirely. No harvest at all. And they did it on top of a second straight closure of the red king crab season. For a town that ran on crab, this was not a bad year. This was the floor falling out from under everything at once. Look at what it did to the town's own budget, because this is where an abstract fishery number turns into whether the street lights stay on. In an ordinary year, the taxes on that crab had brought the city something on the order of $2.5 to $3 million. That money ran the place. For the following year, the town projected it would collect around $200,000. Read those two numbers again, millions down to a couple $100,000. By some accounts, nearly half the city's entire annual budget gone in a single blow, all of it tied to one animal that the ocean had quietly stopped producing. And it did not bounce back the next season. The big processing plant, the one described as the largest snow crab plant in the country, stayed shut, not for 1 year, into a third straight year. And so the people began to do the one thing that, for most of this island's history, was never permitted. The same people whose ancestors were hauled out to this rock and forbidden to leave, whose grandparents were evacuated at gunpoint and interned, began quietly to go. When the work is gone and the money is gone, a family does the math, and some of them buy the ticket off the island. The population, which had peaked at somewhere around 700 or 800 people in the early 1990s, has now more than halved. Only a few hundred remain, and the number keeps drifting down. And that's the whole terrible symmetry of St. Paul Island. For 2 centuries, the sea was the thing that trapped these people here. It was full of animals worth money, so 2 governments in turn brought the Unangan out to this rock and would not let them go. The wealth of the water is a cage, and now, in our own time, that same sea has turned the lock the other way. The water is emptying, the crab is gone, the money is gone, and the sea that once held these people captive for 200 years is at last quietly letting them go. Not by opening the door and setting them free, by taking away one animal at a time every last reason to stay.